I had gone to the doctor with my 70-year-old blind mother. My mother was widowed, and it had been 20 years since my father passed away. Someone had taken advantage of my mother's blindness and committed a disgusting crime against her. When I discovered this truth, I was stunned after learning about the criminal. Sitting in the doctor's room, I would sometimes look at the doctor's face and sometimes look at my mother sitting outside the room. For me, believing this truth was difficult. What my ears were hearing was unbelievable. My head began to spin, and my heart was pounding loudly. I started losing consciousness, and sweat droplets started falling from my face. I took the report from the doctor's hand and came outside, holding my mother's hand, and walked out of the clinic. My mother hadn't been feeling well for the past few days. Whatever she ate, she felt like throwing up. I thought her digestive system had become weak, so I took her to the nearby clinic. But what the doctor told me pulled the ground from under my feet. The doctor called me alone and said, "Your mother is pregnant." Upon hearing this, my mind stopped working. Who could do this to my mother? There were only 3 men in my house: my husband, my father-in-law, and my younger brother-in-law. My mother lived with me at my in-laws' house. Apart from me, she had no one in this world. After my father passed away, she raised me with great difficulty and got me married. My husband had allowed my mother to live with us in the house. Now, the only question in my mind was who had done this disgusting thing to my mother. My mother stayed with me all day. When I was working in the kitchen, she would sit at the table in the kitchen and keep talking to me. Throughout the day, my husband, my brother-in-law, and my father-in-law were not at home. They would only go to the mosque during prayer time and sometimes sit with their friends outside. They would return home only after Isha prayers. My husband had passed away a year ago, and my father-in-law had not remarried. My brother-in-law respected me and my mother very much. Most of the time, he kept to his own work. He had never tried to be informal with me, nor had he ever spoken to my mother except to greet her. It had been years since my father's death, and my mother had not remarried because of me. She was blind, and she didn't want her second husband to take advantage of her blindness and do something wrong with me. But today, someone had taken advantage of my mother's blindness and done something to her, which was tormenting my soul. After my father's death, many marriage proposals came, but I had set a condition that I could not leave my mother alone. She was blind and could not stay alone at home. I took care of her, so I couldn't leave her alone. This is why my marriage had not been settled until now. Because in a house where a boy's mother already lives, how could she tolerate the fact that her son's wife would live with her too? Therefore, those who agreed to marry under this condition had no women in their house, only 3 men. One was their father, my husband, and his younger brother. When I left for my in-laws' house, a room for my mother was ready. My husband respected my mother very much. My brother-in-law was studying at the university, and he used to stay outside the house for a long time, but there was nothing that suggested I should suspect these people. However, the report I had in my hand at that moment was telling me something entirely different. Reluctantly, my thoughts started to turn toward the men in my house. I was trapped in a huge dilemma. Although my husband was very good and took great care of my mother and me, what had happened to my mother was making me question everything. If I had asked about it in my in-laws' house, I would undoubtedly have been thrown out along with my mother. I was very troubled. When I reached home, I didn't tell my mother anything. If I had informed her, her blood pressure might have shot up. She already had high blood pressure. My mind was completely overwhelmed. Who should I suspect? Who was committing such a vile act? When I reached home, I was dizzy and went straight to my mother's room to sit with her. "What's the matter, son? Why are you sitting so quietly?" "What did the doctor say?" my mother asked me. I was a very talkative person, always chatting, but today it felt like my speech had stopped. "Nothing, Mom. The doctor just gave me some medicine. You'll be fine," I said. Then I laid my mother down on her bed and went to the kitchen to prepare the food. But my mind was constantly on my mother. She couldn't see with her eyes, but she could feel, right? Who was coming near her? Could it be my father-in-law or my brother-in-law? The tension in my mind kept increasing, and my head started spinning. No one was giving me the truth or the answers. What should I do? Who should I talk to? My husband, father-in-law, and brother-in-law would never tolerate such a thing. How should I talk to my mother about this? How could I tell her? Farouk came back from the office and brought roses and garlands for me, but I couldn't even smile. The trouble I was going through was beyond description, unbearable. Seeing me quiet, he started asking me questions. "What happened? Why are you quiet? Is everything okay?" What could I say in response? I told him I had a headache. He said, "Eat something and then take your medicine. I was thinking of taking you for a long drive after eating, but since you're not feeling well, you should rest." After having the food, I went to my room and hid my mother's reports in the wardrobe. I wanted to know.
Finally, who comes into my mother's room at night? When Farouk came into the room, I said, "Mom is not feeling well. I want to sleep with her." After hearing this, he didn't object and said, "What's there to ask? Go, take care of your mother." Farouk was a very good person. He never got strict with me regarding my mother's matters. I went to lie down with my mom. She was sleeping, but hearing her mumbling in her sleep, I was stunned. This meant that someone was coming to my mother's room at night. I couldn't sleep the whole night. No one came into the room that night. The next morning after breakfast, Farouk and my younger brother-in-law left the house. My father-in-law went to his room. I brought my mother into my room and asked her, "Who comes into your room at night?" What my mother told me was enough to shock me. Initially, I suspected my father-in-law because he was always present in the house, but then I remembered that he prayed 5 times a day. My heart started feeling very uneasy. On one hand, he was always praying and talking, but on the other hand, I sometimes started suspecting my brother-in-law, who stayed awake until late at night. There were sounds of the TV coming from his room. Once, he told me, "You look just like your mother. Your mother is very beautiful. She looks more like your older sister than your mother." He said this in the early days of my marriage. I had laughed it off, but now just thinking about it ignited a fire inside me, one that was unbearable. Someone was making my mother unconscious and doing something forceful with her. My mother could feel that something inappropriate was happening with her, but she was too confused. For me, this was absolutely intolerable. How could someone with no shame take advantage of a blind, helpless, sick woman like that? My helplessness was that if I raised my voice, I would be branded with the mark of divorce. Farouk was a good person, but he would never speak against his father. My father-in-law always referred to my mother as sister-in-law. In front of me, he never even looked at my mother, but what he was doing under the guise of respect was a very disgusting act. I began to feel anger towards my father-in-law. Once, when he brought fruits from the market for me, he gave me an extra kilogram of apples and said, "Your mother is becoming weaker. You probably don't order anything for her because of hesitation, so give her this reason." At that moment, I thought he was taking care of my mother. One night, when I woke up, Farouk was not in the room. After a long time, he came back into the room. I asked, "Where did you go?" He said, "I have a habit of smoking. When Abba falls into a deep sleep at night, I go to the courtyard to smoke, because if Abba smells the cigarette, he scolds me immediately." I smiled and said, "He is just talking for your own good." But the ordinary things that happen in every house, even those started to seem suspicious to me. My mind began to race in all directions. I had to reach the criminal no matter what. Who was it? My father-in-law? My brother-in-law? Or my husband? Thinking about it all made my mind feel like it was going to explode, because this was bound to affect my married life, and it was possible that my home could be destroyed. My mother, at this age, had fallen into a huge trouble, an agonizing situation she was unaware of. For me, this was a double trouble. How could I tell my mother this truth, the one I had heard from the doctor? She couldn't handle this. Even if I didn't tell her, how long could this be hidden? I was silent, but the pain and distress I was going through inside was something only I knew. Now I kept making excuses to Farouk every day, saying that my mother's health was not good, so I wanted to sleep by her side. Night after night, I waited for the person who was the cause of my mother's suffering. For a few days, Farouk remained silent, but then he stopped saying anything and began to behave distantly with me. In his eyes, I could clearly see the doubt. We had been married only a few months, and he used to love me very much. He spent the whole day at the office, and when he came home at night, he wanted to spend some time with me. But I, who was trapped in my own mental distress, couldn't even realize Farouk's love for me anymore. I even started forgetting to do household work. At night, I forgot to iron Farouk's clothes. He was already upset with me, and when he was late for the office in the morning, he angrily ironed his own clothes. When I mentioned ironing his clothes, he glared at me angrily and said, "Just serve your mother. She's the only one important for you." He was so angry at that time that he didn't listen to anything I said, didn't have breakfast, and left for the office. I was upset because of my mother, and on top of that, Farouk's behavior made my heart break. I sat in my room and started crying. At night, Farouk's mood was very bad, so I didn't even ask for permission to go into my mother's room. I had already apologized to Farouk for my mistake, but he said, "Don't embarrass me by asking for forgiveness. You should understand I don't even get a chance to talk to you the whole day." He quickly agreed, but the next morning my mother asked, "Why didn't you sleep by my side last night? When you don't come, he comes, and that night is always painful for me." My mother started crying while clinging to me. My heart broke, and tears started flowing. Who was doing this? I had no relatives in this city, no one I could trust to leave my mother with. If she could have seen, I would have arranged for her accommodation elsewhere. But she was a helpless woman, and I had to take her to the washroom. I was stuck in this dilemma, not knowing what to do and what not to. Then, one time, I heard my mother shouting. I quickly sat up, and when I looked around, Farouk wasn't in the room either. I rushed out and found my brother-in-law in my mother's room. My mother was screaming, waving her hands helplessly, as if trying to get away from someone. She was saying, "Stay away from me." My brother-in-law was standing a little distance from her bed and looked at me with clueless eyes. Seeing him in my mother's room, an overwhelming sense of fear took over me. I grabbed my brother-in-law by the collar and shouted, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself, doing such disgusting things with my mother?" His face turned pale and he nervously replied, "Papi, what are you saying? I just came here because I heard your mother screaming." Angrily, I said, "You're lying. You're just making excuses. You've been making my mother a victim of your lust every day." My brother-in-law and husband both arrived at the scene. My brother-in-law tried to free himself from my grip, and my husband also came to me. My brother-in-law angrily yelled, "Your mother is like my mother. You should be ashamed of yourself for making such an accusation. I was sleeping and heard your mother's screams, and I rushed here," her retorted. "You're lying." My husband took my brother-in-law's collar off me and yelled at me, "What's this drama you've created in the middle of the night? At this time of night you are screaming. What will the neighbors think about us?" I ignored Farouk's words and said, "Arman is not a good boy. He makes my mother unconscious every night and does this with her." Just as I was saying this, a loud slap hit my face and I fell back. Farouk screamed angrily, "What nonsense are you saying? Whatever comes to your mouth, you speak. Who are you to accuse my brother?" My father-in-law was even angrier and said, "We took his mother in, thinking she was helpless, treated her like a sister in our house, and now you are accusing our son?" Finally, what I feared happened. My home was breaking apart. Farouk said, "Your mother cannot stay in this house. I will arrange somewhere else for her." I was already mentally traumatized, and now where was I supposed to go with my mother? I had already rented my house after marriage, and it wasn't easy to vacate it so quickly. I was so distressed that I collapsed. When I regained consciousness, Farouk was standing next to me, looking a bit concerned and angry. I had an IV drip, and the doctor was suggesting that Farouk take care of me. He remained completely silent. As soon as the drip was finished, Farouk took me home. He brought me to the room, sat me down, and then sat in front of me. He then said, "I told Farouk, if the cheap accusations I have placed on my honor are wrong, then provide me with proof. If he is innocent, I will have to accept it, but if the culprit is any one of you, then tell me what punishment they should receive." Farouk's tone softened, and he said, "If any one of us is guilty, we will hand them over to the police." A few days later, the DNA reports were in front of me. The first report to show that it was Farouk who was my father. When I saw the report, I was stunned. According to the DNA, all three of them were innocent. I thought maybe they had fabricated the reports, but Farouk had taken me himself to the lab where the tests were done, and it was a well-known lab. Now I was confused and lost, wondering who was doing all of this. Farouk had placed a camera in my mother's room. A few days later, as soon as a person entered the room, Farouk caught him. The person had a mask on. When the mask was removed, I was shocked to find out that he was a beggar from our street. The window of my mother's room opened to the back alley, and this beggar would come in from there. He would drug my mother and then abuse her. Farouk immediately handed him over to the police. I went and apologized to everyone, joined my hands, and had my mother's DNA tested too, so there would be no doubt. I thought that not every person is bad. After discussing it with my family and getting my mother's consent, I took her to the hospital and had her abortion done, because my mother had no fault in this matter. She was carrying the burden of someone else's sins. The real criminal was now behind bars. After this, Farouk arranged for a maid for my mother, who still lives with her and takes care of her. But even today, when I recall this incident, my heart sinks, thinking about what my poor mother went through. Friends, I request you, if your parents are old, blind, or unable to do things for themselves, then place a camera in their room and keep an eye on them, so that you can know if they are in any trouble. If you can't be with them for hours, or if you're married, this kind of arrangement would be better. I hope you learned something from this incident. Please share this lovely story further, and don't forget to like our video. Liking helps.